Hello, comrades, sisters, and brothers. I am Reverend Terrence Melvin, Chair of the Global African Worker Institute, and I want to welcome my family from all over the world for joining us today. This is the second episode of our web series that focuses on the obstacles and organizing of Africans and those throughout the diaspora. The Global African Worker Institute, along with allied organizations, started this web series to begin the voices of the people out to the forefront. All over the world, we see fools with titles and power make decisions that cripple our communities. It is time for our voice to be heard. Each week, we will look into another part of the globe impacted by neoliberal capitalism and the transatlantic slave trade. Last week, we started with Southern Africa. You can view this on ITCU Africa YouTube page. This week, we come to you from the Caribbean, islands known for their beauty and their dependence on foreign dollars. These nations lie in the cradle of climate change and offshore capitalism. Next week, we will hear from Eastern Africa and the people from that region as we circle back to the motherland. As always, I want to thank you again for joining us. And I would like to bring on our moderator for the remainder of the show, Brother Amalakar Sanatan. I turn it over to you at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Terrence Melvin, and it is a pleasure to be here to support a conversation, a regional dialogue happening with the global African workers and really focusing on the context of the Caribbean. And like all other regions in the world, there are specific realities here that we want to communicate to complicate some of the narratives around Blackness, but to advance justice specifically to our region and connect ourselves to a wider global reality. So in the Caribbean right now, there are a lot of situations. There's a rhythm, a vibration of things being felt in the world. Right now in the United States, there's an increase in the deportation flights of Haitians in the lead up to a general election that they have for president. We have the NSAS movement in Nigeria, which has raised important questions of ending police brutality, ending corruption in post-colonial societies, and masses of people in a class-based struggle raising those issues. This is actually reverberating in the feelings of the Caribbean, which saw similar protests. 2020 has been a period, yes, for COVID-19, but also a period of intensified social justice movements, intensified and amplified racial justice organizing. Right now in Barbados, not only is the question of monuments being put on the table, and should we continue having colonial relics have the stature to stand in our cities, the question of republicanism to transform the political status of our societies. Not every country in the Caribbean has taken the path of Trinidad and Tobago, Cuba, and Guyana. Many of them are still in a Commonwealth relationship, a type of colonial relationship with England still, sometimes Spain and France. So these are the questions we have to grapple with. And I think it brings us forward to a very important moment where we could have deep conversations. Our guests for this morning are three esteemed colleagues who will be able to lead a conversation and speak about their realities and contribute to the global dialogue on African workers. First, we'll have Linda Bogle-Mainzer. Linda Bogle-Mainzer is a progressive activist who believes in the role of intersectionality in her analyses and organizing. She often says, unless we ensure the rights and protection of the marginalized, we will fail as a community. The way forward is to seek the commonalities in the fight. She is a born Bermudian and deeply passionate about the success of her country and family. Currently, she is the second vice president of the Bermuda Public Services Union and LGBTQI representative for Public Service International's Caribbean region. She has been a station duty officer with the Bermuda Police Service for over 23 years. As a community activist and proud member of the LGBTQI community, she's committed to being a change she wants to see in the world. Next, we will have Elena Lorak. Elena is a founding member and coordinator of the Reconocido movement, which since 2011 promotes the human rights of Dominicans of Haitian descent in the Dominican Republic. The Reconocido movement engages groups in the batallas, promotes the rights of youth, and steers conversations about decolonization in the Dominican Republic. And our last speaker we'll have, and this is not the order that they'll be in, it's just alphabetical order because it is a conversation we are having this morning, Ms. Akins Vidal. Akins Vidal is a lecturer in the Labor Studies Department of the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies in Trinidad and Tobago. He's also the coordinator of the Elmer Francois Institute for Research and Debate. This institute is a division of the Cipriani Labor College, and it is dedicated to research, publication, and outreach on matters related to social development and social change. His former titles include President of the Trinidad Youth Council, Deputy Political Leader of the Movement for Social Justice, and General Secretary of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions and NGOs. Vidal is a commentator on social issues in Trinidad and Tobago and continues to volunteer his time to people-based organizations in the national community. Now, enough of me. Let us go into a conversation, a type of tour de table. And now I'll ask just for brief introductions, very brief introductions, of course, because we really want to get into the depth of the subject matter we have today. We could begin with Linda to understand who are you, what are the goals of your organization that you represent, and what do you think this dialogue encourages? Linda, the floor is yours.
Good day, comrades. You know, the introduction says it all, so I don't want to reiterate those things. But what I do want to talk about is how privileged I am to begin this conversation, particularly in the Caribbean and the region of Bermuda. And I think it's a necessary conversation. You know, many have highlighted this, the Black Lives Matter movement as the sort of thrust to spotlight the inequalities and the injustice that has happened to Black people for centuries. And I believe unless we take advantage of certainly this time in history to force these conversations, we're going to be still talking like this for many years to come. And that's why I think this type of forum is important. Workers make up the majority of the world in building economies. And we know that our experiences, particularly in the Caribbean and Bermuda and the British Overseas Territories, is that people of color make up the majority of workers in the public sector. So it has impacted us in a way that our fellow humans that don't look like us will never be able to understand. It is an everyday impact. And so I believe that it's important to have this conversation, and it's a perfect time to have it.
Thank you very much, Comrade Linda. Now I would like to bring on Elena Lorak from Dominican Republic to introduce herself.
Muchas gracias, Mical, y al grupo organizador. Para mí es un placer de que me hayan permitido participar de este webinar tan importante. Bueno, como decía Mical, mi nombre es Elena Lorak Pies, soy de República Dominicana, de origen haitiano, y para mí es un honor poder compartir con ustedes las grandes desigualdades y realidades que vive nuestra población en este lado del Caribe y que ha sido también producto de todos los acontecimientos históricos que hasta hoy en día han mermado en nuestra población, dejándonos en una situación de suma vulnerabilidad. Muchísimas gracias, esperamos seguir compartiendo más adelante.
Thank you very much, Comarilena. Now I'd go to Trinidad and Tobago. Akins Vidal.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning to President Melville, to our esteemed moderator for the day and the other panelists. I want to share the sentiments of the other speakers in the importance of something like this. You know, sometimes we think that we can fall into the trap of saying that talking is not enough, or we don't want to end up in another talk shop. So what we do is we avoid the conversations altogether. And I think that we have a moment to be able to move the conversations further and to have deep dive conversations. And that is important. I was having talking with Amelka a little earlier, and we were saying, you know, there's some things that we could say now that we may not have been able to say 5 years ago, that we may not have been able to say 3 years ago. And it's just because of how uncomfortable people felt, or you would have to, before you even begin the conversation, try to justify why you want to have the conversation in the first place. And so because we have this moment in history here where we can have these conversations openly, we have to grab the opportunity with both hands and push it as far as we can and push the envelope as hard as we can and just get us to the point where we're talking openly and we're talking honestly about things. There's a Caribbean-ness that we have to grapple with, where we try to, internationally it would be called sugarcoating, you know, but we use sarcasm and we use fun and we use laughter and jokes to hide the seriousness and the pain of some conversations. And we're slowly and gradually getting to a point where we're facing the realities of the hurts of our historical context, and that could only really redound to the benefit of the entire population as a whole. So I want to just start with those opening words, and I look forward to an engaging conversation with my colleagues.
Oh, thank you very much, everyone, for making definitely brief, well-managed, but extremely insightful conversations that really set the foundation to what we'll be discussing today. So the first question I have, and this is for anyone to answer, but of course, I invite all participants to answer, but we could start with, I think, Linda first. So we'll do it in alphabetical order, and then we'll just go the other way around to make sure people feel included and it has a nice rotation and vibration. I want to ask a question around the issue of movements for racial justice in the region. The conditions facing African people, or we say Afro-descendants in the Caribbean, are challenging, but they are not new. The heightened consciousness globally around racial justice, as what Atkins was alluding to, especially after the Black Lives Matter mobilizations, has reinserted questions of racial justice on policy tables. What are some of the major racial justice issues that have emerged in the region since we have seen this kind of groundswell of action and concern? And has the organization focused on specific areas since? And do you have any strategic plans at this moment? Linda?
Thank you, brother. You know, it's not new. And I like what the brother said earlier. We now have an opportunity to have a open, honest conversation in a way that we have tiptoed around for years. And we tiptoed around it because people weren't ready to have those honest conversations. And we weren't ready to put ourselves in positions to have this honest conversation, because the reality is that they came with pushback and, in a lot of cases, consequences. So you couldn't have these conversations in the workplace like we're having now. You couldn't have these conversations at the policy table. And now it seems like they are palatable because of Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter movement. So in the workplace now, we're having those conversations about policy changes that are necessary to reflect the injustice of people of color in the workplace. Our organization, Public Service International, has grabbed the bull by the horns. We put on seminars to talk about the impact of racism in the workplace. We've included global dialogue around this in our platforms. But more importantly, I want to talk about the everyday intentional of being a person of color in the Caribbean, where, as you said, traditionally the region has shown that persons that are greatly impacted by any disaster, for example, COVID-19, it has hit us as workers in a way that the lockdown alone, if you are in a marginalized group, the lockdown in the Caribbean countries meant that you realized that you were not exposed or have access to things that persons of color would ordinarily take for granted. And so on top of the survival of the lockdown, the survival of the pandemic, in our cases in the public sector, being forced to work through those lockdowns and still having to provide for our family has been extremely difficult. And so we can't go into policy meetings anymore. We can't go into negotiations anymore and not recognize that we have workers of different colors. We can't just clump everybody together and talk about we're negotiating the way forward with a tiny lens. We now have to open up and encourage all of our shop stewards, all of our negotiators to come to the table and bring their entire selves to the table. And I'm excited about that idea. To bring your entire self to the table is something new, because we always came to the table in these straight lenses. And I, as a Black woman, was never encouraged to come to the table as a Black woman. It was okay to come to the table as a unionist, but not as a Black unionist. And now we have to come to the table and bring our whole self to the table. PSI recognizes it. Our union, public service union, recognizes it. We participated in the Black Lives Matter march in Bermuda, which for a small island like Bermuda brought out over 6,000 people. And I think that was the first time that I saw as a movement, people were not afraid to bring themselves as a person of color out and say, listen, we have to now turn our attention to the injustices that have been put against us. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on when we talk about how we have been impacted in terms of that are put back into the public services that are impacting us greatly.
Thank you very much, Comrade Linda. I really embrace that point about bringing your whole, speaking like a West Indian, bring your whole self to the table, you know, but we work with all our identities, and it is difficult. For so much years, shame has been put into our bodies where we apologize for ourselves, put ourselves in compartments like a file cabinet, and we realize how that has inhibited our activism and our organizing itself. I think that's quite powerful. So Elena, would you like to jump in and contribute to this topic? You could respond directly to Linda or take on the broader question about strategizing in a moment of heightened consciousness around racial justice.
Sí. Bueno, yo pienso que para mí, bueno, en nuestra experiencia directamente como movimiento que reivindica todo lo que es la justicia social versus la injusticia que se vive, creo que desde nuestras experiencias, lo digo desde el colectivo en la cual represento, hemos venido trabajando y surgimos directamente a raíz de una situación emergente que afectaba nuestras vidas desde el 2007, 2011, donde nos constituimos como movimiento para defender los derechos de las y los dominicanos de ascendencia haitiana en la República Dominicana. Y esto es todo lo que es a través de la deuda social en la que el Estado y el país, o directamente debe a toda esa población que, si bien es cierto, para mí que vengo de una isla que comparte dos países, ha tenido una historia muy marcada entre estos dos. Y esa historia que se dio entre República Dominicana y Haití, mermando también con toda esa migración y todo eso que se dio forzada desde desde el siglo XVII hasta todo este tiempo, pues ha constituido toda una situación que hoy en día repercute. Y como decía nuestros compañeros, y como bien tú señalaba la pregunta, este movimiento de Black Friday que se dio en este tiempo dentro de esta pandemia, recargar que todas estas situaciones y realidades que vivimos es preexistente al COVID-19 y que hoy se revierte y los pueblos vulnerabilizados son las que más sufren estas consecuencias. Y creo que el movimiento que se dio y en el contexto que se dio y cómo se dio, también ha sido una plataforma, ha sido como un motivo para que las organizaciones, los movimientos jóvenes y de negro podamos alzar la voz. Y nuestra experiencia, sumarnos a esta, de poder conectar estas realidades que se viven tanto en Estados Unidos, tanto en otros países, conectarla a las realidades que vivimos. Sin embargo, vemos que estas...
Que el informe a las 8:30, a la cita de mañana y es a las 8:15.
Ok.
Y vemos cómo esta situación, cuando los movimientos decidimos romper esa barrera, alzar nuestra voz, solidarizarnos con esta realidad y con estas manifestaciones que se están dando a nivel mundial, pues también somos atacados, como es en el caso de nuestro país. Al querer sumarnos, al querer alzar la voz, pues somos atropellados también. Y todo ese movimiento que surge se encuentra de una forma u otra atrapada y es también estigmatizada y vulnerabilizada, tanto por las fuerzas del Estado. Al no entender que este movimiento, y lo digo porque así pasó con nosotros, en el 9 de junio, cuando decidimos varias organizaciones en el cual pertenezco, pues decidimos consolidarizarnos y tomar esta acción que se está dando, como el Black Friday, en Estados Unidos y hacer frente para también visibilizar esto aquí, pues de inmediato pues tenemos esa represión tanto policial representada del Estado, pero no solamente desde esa realidad, sino también nosotras como dominicanos de ascendencia haitiana, la población migrante haitiana y otros. O sea, el querer manifestarse, el querer demostrar que sí somos personas, que sí podemos, que sí tenemos derecho, al igual que todas las personas, de respirar, de caminar, de tener una vida plena con un estado de derecho, pues esto se encuentra en una situación donde encontramos una represión de diferentes formas y acompañada de toda una discriminación estructural que viene permeando y todo lo que es campañas e ideas de odio alimentada por todas esas realidades y experiencias vividas del pasado.
Thank you very much, Comrade Lorak. It was so insightful and a reminder to some of us in the English-speaking area to understand the spatial distinctions between Dominican Republic and Haiti, but also the racial distinctions that reinforces, and of course, the many cultural rules and boundaries we create around Haitians in Dominican Republic, and the type of institutionalization of racism that is a form of violence to their lives. I think that is always important to remind us of the diverse realities of the region. You know, we like to sometimes make total statements about who we are and what we represent, but in each territory, there's a nuance and a complexity to it. And I'm happy to hear about that consolidation. Comrade Vidal, do you have any contributions in Trinidad and Tobago and the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, man. Listen, I want to start with the whole self to the table comment. Um, in our context, and this is not just Trinidad and Tobago, but this is Caribbean. Your whole self is a complicated concept in the Caribbean. If you don't have multiple selves, then you're really setting yourself up to not even be able to survive. So the Negro, the African, the Trinidadian, the Tobagonian, the Bermudan all live in the same person at any given point in time. And sometimes we're all of those things and sometimes we're none of those things. And how does this translate when you're trying to do work? We are in an interesting period in time. So we have the Black Lives Matter, which the recent incarnation starts in May. But then this happens while we're under COVID lockdown. And what it does is it forces us to look at the stratification in a Caribbean context through a racial lens and through a class lens, which we may not have been able to otherwise, because what the COVID lockdown did is to very clearly demonstrate the differences in our positions in the society. And one of the challenges we have as Africans in a Caribbean context is the blurring of class and racial lines because of our history, because of our historical experience. So you have a lot of persons who, even though they might look like us, consciously, they're still very much rooted in the colonial thinking. So when we started to have discussions among trade unions about how do you secure the lives of the most vulnerable in the society, the majority of whom are African, there's no question about that. The majority of whom are African, who have some of the lowest paying jobs, whose jobs are more fluid than other persons who engage in what we would call a hustle. They're the first ones to take the hit, and they're predominantly African. How do you protect those persons? How do you ensure that there's a net for them? And the politicians and those who had other plans didn't have to say anything, because the middle class African community came to the defense of the administrators and came to the defense of the business community against the mass of the Black population. And that's why I'm saying that in a Caribbean context, there are real things that we have to discuss about who we are and how many times we create our own challenges as workers and not seeing working class as a collective, but that we allow consciousness and false consciousness to dictate how we behave more often than not. And we then find ourselves in a position where we're fighting against ourselves, and which of course doesn't lead us anywhere at all. So you talk about the stay-home orders and asking people to hold on for another month or hold on for another week. And there's almost no sympathy for the fact that there are many persons in our societies who live day to day. And that was one of the most painful experiences for me personally, to hear some of the discussions around how we treat with those communities. And what we decided to do as the college is we ran a series of webinars around titled Workers' Rights Are Not Quarantined. Because one of the things that we recognize is that many employers took the opportunity to dismiss workers, to abuse the law, to go around the law, because there was this thing called COVID, and it's an economically trying time for us. And so let's take the opportunity to trim some fat and send some workers home. And they did it without engaging the law, because trade unions were not recognized as essential and trade unions were not allowed to function in the first phase of our lockdown period. And so the business community really was allowed to run rampant. And the interesting thing that happened with BLM coming on board at the time that it did, particularly for us, because we then started having our uprising in June. We had a solidarity event early in June, and then late in June, we had an extrajudicial killing that forced some conversations about Africanness, about the value of African life, regardless of who the person is, but the value of life and whether we treat everyone in the same way or not. And what it did is it forced some persons to backpedal and to think about this dichotomy of haves and have-nots and how the society treats one group in relation to another. And we had an opportune moment that we lost because, well, we went into a general election, which, as you know, in the Caribbean throws everything out of the window, and we then begin to focus on election. So there was a moment, and so I'm excited by the moment. I'm still not naive about the moment, but I'm excited that there is a possibility, and activities like this will definitely help us to have the correct kind of conversations. And I just want to end by saying, end this part of my contribution. I say that I have to explain, I tell my class sometimes, when Bob Marley says, emancipate yourself from mental slavery, he's not talking to the sufferer in the ghetto. He's not talking to the man on the block and the man on the street. The man on the street is the closest to the oppression of colonialism. Nobody has to tell him that he's still in a colonial mindset or he's still in a colonial state. It's those of us who are African who, because of success, we think that we've somehow overcome colonialism because of individual success and individualism, that we now promote colonial structures as the panacea for everything. Those are the ones who are in mental slavery, not the man on the block who's on the ground. I want to stop there.
But wow, what I like about these conversations is prior to them, you prepare questions, to have a kind of constructive dialogue and a common framework. But then after the speakers hit you for six, or I don't know, when baseball hit you out the park, I don't know what is the relevant sports metaphor I could apply, but we really enjoyed the dialogue. And I think I would like to look specifically at COVID-19 economic recovery and issues of race and class. And I have to throw it back to Atkins, and we'll just work the order the other way around. Globally, we are seeing COVID-19 economic recovery committees globally have around 24% of women's participation on it. But also, they have been recruiting primarily from major sectors of industry at the expense of labor participating at those tables. Young people are also excluded from those tables. Something that has been happening with the racial justice dialogue is that as much as we identify with the struggles of African Americans and the work that they do, the hegemony of US media is a reality. And sometimes the critique of race relations there is communicated around the world as if that Blackness in the United States is normative, which it is not. The struggle for Afro-Brazilians and Afro-descended persons living in France, there are commonalities, but there are certain ways that they relate it. One of the conversations we often have to have, I think, with our counterparts and colleagues in the United States is why a class analysis is so important, especially in a post-colonial society, when those who occupy institutions that have colonial regimes of power, neo-colonial regimes of power, have our complexion. So the complexion is the same, but the complexity, the complexity is the same, but the complexion is the little kind of thing that we work with. And that's why I love how you brought up the question of general elections. So I think there's a lack of focus on poverty when we talk about race. We always talk about Black as if Black is located as a homogeneous group. Yes, culturally and socially, our complexion alone positions us or makes us victims of violence disproportionately. But I want to talk about tabling the conversation of racial justice with poverty and economic inequalities. And I'll start with Atkins.
Yeah, thanks. What has that? I think that is the key that they're trying to unlock there, and that is what is at the core of the conversation. What are the constructs of the societies that we live in? The African American experience is not the Caribbean or Afro-Caribbean experience. Neither is the English-speaking Afro-Caribbean experience the same as the French or Spanish speaking. If we in the, and what has happened too is a lot of watering down of our historical context, because I'm a historian. So that is where I use that context all the time. So the role that Haiti played in the emancipation struggle and in the intensity of rebellion just before emancipation has been for a long time ignored by the early historians, because they were not interested in that kind of dialogue, because violence and so on, has a particular connotation, right? And we look at Haiti today and we try to say, well, that is an example of why Black people shouldn't be in charge of anything. When we talk about economic empowerment, and this is another conversation that I know America and I have had a few times, there's cultural empowerment of African people, but we always tend to have that conversation at the expense of the conversation about economic and political empowerment. Those are two critical components. When we talk about unionization, when we talk about sharing the pie equally and so on, all of that is part of that dialogue that has to take place, that is starting to take place, not at the pace that I would like, but it is starting to take place. How do you make the nexus between, in a Caribbean context, it just magically happens that everyone at the bottom seems to look exactly alike? That's because there's a historical reason for that. It's not, but then what happens is that the next part of the dialogue is that, well, it's because there's something wrong with African people. And then those African people who are successful in the middle join that conversation and say, well, it's something about our community and them people, and they have to change the way that they behave. And part of that is because of what we've been taught. So in teaching my classes, when I explain to them how many persons of African descent in the region have had global impact per capita, the Caribbean has produced more intellectuals, dare I say, than anywhere else in the world per capita. At our size, it has been phenomenal. Our work as Caribbean people in the civil rights movement in the US is phenomenal, and continues to be even in the current context. So, Amelka, to bring back to your fundamental question, the trade union movement in the region has to see this conversation as theirs as well. They can't hide from it. The construct of class and race are intertwined in a Caribbean context. And you have CLR James, you have George Padmore, you have a number of persons who understood that very clearly. I was just doing George Weeks this week in class. So students understand that these men were not functioning in an abstraction, they were functioning in a moment of consciousness. And it is disheartening really to see that even as the Black Lives Matter movement started to move, you didn't see a concomitant kind of movement from the leadership of the movement, of the trade union movement, that their consciousness had also been affected. Because if they are not, and they're the leadership, and they're the ones who have to argue economic justice, they're the ones who have to, they're not going to do it in the correct context. And I think that is what part of the issue is. So I hope that I've been able to at least answer the question that you've posed.
Well, thank you very much, comrade, for those profound insights and in the reality, but also posing a challenge to the labor movement to really infuse that public dialogue and see why it is relevant, not just to the membership, to the society. Comrade Elena Lorak, I would love to hear about the role of a race class analysis in the work that you do. You alluded to it earlier, but if you could expound on it more specifically.
Bueno, totalmente de acuerdo con el compañero de Vidale, quien expresa que las realidades de los pueblos son sumamente diferentes. Y es básicamente en esto que hemos también trabajado y hemos establecido y entendido de que cuando vamos a la literatura y ver que nuestras concepciones directamente y como lo que predomina en el contexto actual es la colonialidad directamente, pensada desde lo que se ha implementado desde el pasado hasta ahora. Y cuando hablamos de este contexto, y como se explicaba, debemos de ver todo desde una forma interseccional y para poder ir entendiendo las realidades que pasan. Porque directamente desde nuestro país no podemos desconectar desde las realidades que vivimos, no directamente como técnica o teórica, sino desde las realidades que hemos entendido desde niña. Desde niña, sí, o sea, en mi adolescencia, hablar de tema de negritud y todas las situaciones que pasan hoy nuestro pueblo, pues no lo entendería porque a nosotros no nos criaron así. O sea, nací en un batey, que es también una población muy marginalizada dentro de la sociedad dominicana, que luego es que ahora entiendo que este espacio, que este lugar, es un espacio de todo lo que es el sustento del Estado. El batey es construido alrededor directamente de los cañaverales y desde el siglo XIX y toda la contextura, la historia dominicana se ha marcado con todo el pueblo haitiano en la negociación y todo el proceso de traslado de las manos de obras haitianas baratas hacia nuestro país. Y entonces, dada esta realidad, es donde esa migración que llega de una forma de esclavitud, como lo consideramos una esclavitud moderna, porque cuando uno lee, y mi visión desde niña, en la comunidad, el trabajo en esas plantaciones de azúcar, cuando uno lee la historia de la esclavitud, de cómo fueron traídas las personas africanas a todos estos continentes para ser esclavizados, es lo que directamente se vive se vivía y se da en las plantaciones azucareras de nuestro país. Y hoy en día nos encontramos ante todo este proceso a una población migrante haitiana que se desplazó, pero muchos de ellos también han sido traídos por todo ese proceso y ese engranaje que se da. Y hoy en día vemos esta misma población que vive desamparada, esa población no directamente organizada en su totalidad, porque hay un movimiento que lucha por el derecho de las personas cañeras en el país pero lucha por la reivindicación de la pensión de esa persona, de la pensión, del derecho a disfrutar de su pensión que se le fue descontado en ese momento. Sin embargo, hasta ahora son pocos los que han recibido esto, pero no necesariamente ese movimiento reivindica lo que es la negritud, reivindica lo que es ser negro, reivindica lo que hoy en día directamente pasan los hijos, las hijas de 2, de 3 generaciones de estas personas migrantes haitianas que fueron traídas al país para poder constituir y establecer toda la economía del país. Si nos vamos en los años, desde el siglo XIX para acá, la economía dominicana era fundamental desde la producción de la caña de azúcar. Y todo esto ha permitido el desarrollo tanto del país. Pero cuando nos vamos a los alrededores, cuando vamos a estos lugares donde están estas poblaciones que directamente fueron el pilar para el desarrollo de la economía, pues nos encontramos con una vulnerabilidad, con una pobreza existente que crea esa grande desigualdad, no solamente desde esa población, sino también desde sus descendientes. Y Amícar hablaba todo lo que era el tema de las mujeres y de las negociaciones también, con todo el contexto que estamos viviendo ahora, de poder decidir de que sí, estas personas importan las mujeres, la vida del negro importa en todas sus dimensiones. sus hijos, sus familias, su entorno, su cultura, que también es otra realidad que se vive desde esta región. No es nada más estamos hablando de la parte económica, que es también toda la explotación y la extracción de todo lo que de un pueblo, desde su conocimiento. También lo que se quiere vivenciar, el etnocidio, el genocidio de todas estas culturas que directamente trae estas personas. Y actualmente vemos que las mujeres y los hombres migrantes haitianos, en su gran mayoría, también viven estas realidades. Las mujeres cargan esto, porque yo siempre digo o decimos que las mujeres en todas estas políticas económicas que se dieron desde Estado, nación y todo eso, la mano de la mujer, sobre todo la mujer migrante, ha sido invisibilizada. Y no hay esa recuperación de esa deuda social que tiene directamente el Estado con el país. Y cuando entonces vemos y analizamos todos esos procesos que se dan a nivel global, pues nos damos cuenta que aunque sea de manera diferente, pero los impactos son fuertes. Vemos que la población negra en todas sus dimensiones son las que enfrentan las grandes desigualdades, son las que para que tú des un paso, tienes que esforzarte muchísimos más para tú poder llegar, porque la pobreza, las desigualdades y las trabas existenciales del pasado venimos cargándonos con ella, y poder salir y vernos ahora en adelante, que quizás la persona podrían decir, pero hay un paso, hay un avance a esto, pero cuando lo analizamos, ¿cómo vamos a ver avance cuando todavía se le desconoce la nacionalidad de un joven por su origen, porque pertenece, porque su padre es haitiano, porque su madre es haitiano? Cuando hay un estado de apatridia, de jóvenes que no podemos estudiar, que no podemos trabajar, que no pueden ir a la universidad en pleno siglo XXI. Entonces, cuando vemos esta parte, es también este gueto, esa presión de oprimir y todo eso. Y como decía el compañero, entendemos que el empoderamiento es lo que en realidad nos llevará a poder defender y a poder sobresalir y poder presentar todas estas realidades que vivimos. Pero no menos cierto que en el mundo que vivimos, las desigualdades impactan de manera tan fuerte que hoy en día se ha normalizado. Y se puede ver que el hecho de que tú no tengas una documentación, bueno, es porque el Estado lo determina así. Pero cuando lo analizamos en su contexto, nos damos cuenta de dónde venimos. Somos descendientes de africanos. ¿Y qué trae el africano? Somos descendientes de migrantes haitianos. ¿De dónde proviene el haitiano? ¿Cuál ha sido su historia? Se reconoce la independencia haitiana en la República Dominicana como un hecho histórico, heroico, como algo que fue fundamental para la población negra. Pues no es así. La población, en estudio que se ha hecho, la población dominicana es negra, pero cuando se vamos a la realidad, la población no se considera directamente negra, ni afrodescendiente. Entonces, todas estas cuestiones, estas cuestionantes, pues también va a retardar, va a retrasar a que podamos avanzar en ese movimiento de justicia social y que sea integral, no solamente de una parte, de otra parte, para que pueda haber este avance de buscar esa liberación directamente que tenemos como pueblos negros en el Caribe. Gracias.
Thank you, Comrade Lorak. That was inspiring to hear about the questions of citizenship. I think you helped raise around it, and equal participation of Afro-descendants in Dominican Republic in those situations. I don't know what you call it, if you call them Pueblos Jóvenes too, but that type of ghetto reality that is very real, but also confining labor to certain domains and the human potential to explore it in many facets. you know, that it is part of the unfairness of the system, but also the way that they take away your dignity from your work. I'd like to go to Comrade Linda, but I just want to preface this a little bit. I remember Atkins, you know, Atkins is the boss of the panel discussions, and he chairs and creates a consortium for views and opinions with different regional leaders, especially in trade union movement, but also who may inherit political office now, and also encourage young persons to participate. Elena, I only had the opportunity to read about you online, and I saw that you work with you, especially with young people, and mobilizing them to pursue justice. And I think it was interesting how you look at decolonization and language, because that's an important conversation for us as well. Or in countries like the Eastern Caribbean states, that yes, they speak English, but Creole is a very important role for them. But Linda, I always think about Linda and her Facebook lives, and being very active and in the public sphere, and communicating with the audience directly. So for Comrade Linda, I wanted to know about that type of action. First, I want to know, in the movements you took part in, you felt that there was a certain type of communication around this race and class analysis, or did you have to introduce that dialogue strategically in different ways, you know?
It's obviously something that you have to introduce, unfortunately, because people tend to see social justice as separate from workers' rights and the workers' movement. And I think this is where our local organizations, particularly in our unions, have failed to close that gap between the two ideas. I absolutely believe that unless workers understand the impact of social justice as it relates to decisions that are made in the workplace that will impact their employment, then they will be left behind in the narrative. I give, for example, when we talk about tax reform. So we're talking about tax reform as an institution. A lot of what we saw coming out of COVID was related to business decisions and how public sector money was going to be spent. And when that money was not available from the shared sacrifice, they turned to the workers and they started to put policies in place that impacted the workers' wages. And the worker didn't push back, and the organizations did not push back because they were made to feel like this was their obligation. And the majority of the workers that it impacted was people of color in a dramatic financial way. And so we as unions have to now push the idea that when you as workers are making decisions when it comes to elections, then you have to realize what that platform will do for your employment. And so look at places like Barbados and now Bermuda. You have a government that has a vast majority. Bermuda is 30-5, right? And ironically enough, it is a labor government. But we're not having the relevant conversations around tax reform that impact the majority of people of color in your country. And I like when Brother Vidal talked about sometimes we struggle in this conversation because the people that are sitting at the table look like us, right? So the people at the table look like us, but we don't want to force them to start to look at laws and policies and institutions of systematic racism that are built into our constitutions, built into our laws, that never intended for us to prosper, never intended for us to move past our statuses in life as workers. We did some research recently that said that people of color, particularly in Bermuda, are the most educated people in the country, but are the lowest paid, are the least successful in upward mobility. And so when workers make decisions to not be actively involved in social justice around tax reform, social justice around criminal reform, they don't realize that because they are not vested in that part of the decision making, it will ultimately impact their employment. We raised $930 million in Bermuda to cover us over this next 3 years as we try to re-stimulate our economy, but we reduced the salary of public servants. And so when we as unions talk about the shared sacrifice, if the private sector doesn't want to participate, the only thing that can force them to participate has to be tax reform. But we don't want to have those conversations about tax reform because it will force persons that don't look like us to actually participate in a system that they set up not to prosper us anyway. And so it is important for us as unions, it's important for us as global unions to have those conversations built into our strategic plan about how we want to move workers, not only as workers, but also as citizens and people of color in particularly countries like Bermuda and the other overseas territories that policy is directly impacted from what I call the motherland, right? And so when they talk about things like the governor recently had a conversation and he lauded Britain for funding up to $1 million in support for PPEs during the COVID. And I think that when he gave that delivery, he is most proud of himself for doing what they ought to do if you're going to hold a country as a colony, right? But if we as workers don't make that connection between the decisions that are made from the motherland down through a progressive Labor Party and on to the public sector workers, then we are going to stay stuck and keep trying to, as the brother said, fighting amongst ourselves for the crumbs. And those things have to be done through how you elect, how you have elections, but also how you hold those in power and government accountable. And so now, if you look at countries like Barbados and Bermuda that have these overwhelming elections and defeat, the opposition is no longer the actual opposition. The opposition must be the people, and the people are voters. The people are voters who are, in essence, the workers of that country, the people of color in that country. And so it is a obligation that we have as a union to no longer stay on the side and say we're not going to be involved in political conversations. We must be involved in tax reform. We must be involved in criminal justice reform. A couple of years ago, there were only 2 people that don't look like me incarcerated. And we cannot sweep those stats under the carpet. And the reason why more people that look like me are committing crimes is because of the tax structures. It's because of the economic structure that we have in this country that don't try to make my life better. And we can no longer be quiet that the people that are running those systems are now look like me. You must be involved in social justice, and unions must push that agenda.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bogle. And actually, part of this dialogue is the issues of political development, elections, the issues about the multiple political actors in a society, the role of labor, but the status of labor in leading an economic process. It makes me ask questions about the way our societies are organized. And this is actually going specifically to Elena, but I know it will have a certain resonance with Comrade Vidal and Comrade Bogle. See, Comrade Elena, the mestizo culture is a reality we have to contend with. In the Francophone territories, les gens de couleur is a reality. It is not just a complexion, it is a status one occupies, being a descendant of a freed colored class, you know. In the Caribbean also, as I always say, they say the book is 50 Shades of Gray, we have 50 Shades of Brown. There's a spectrum in which we organize ourselves around privilege, status, but also have historical relationships to sectors in the economy, which doesn't mean there's an automatic racial solidarity. And Comrade Vidal was speaking about this because we look like each other and so on. We are very clear on where we stand apart from each other. So I want to talk about the question of nationalism, because what is happening in Bolivia and the indigenous movements and their struggle for decolonization has really shown how nationalism is fighting with that language of race, and race being inserted into it, or ethnicity, and the dignity, the rights and sovereignty of peoples in a society. And we see in Latin America, there's a real wave for Afro-descendant people to affirm themselves. Yes, I'm Brazilian. Yes, I'm Colombian, I'm Peruvian, but I'm Afro-Peruvian, Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Colombian. And that is a type of conversation that has happened in moments in the Caribbean, but I think it is very much due to begin again. So I want to trouble that idea. I don't really have a specific question on it, but your broad feelings about the way nationalism and our investment in the narrative of the state, but also a sense of commitment and identity to our place, because we do feel this is ours at times, and the way we think about race and the way it does not make us feel that this place is ours many times. Comrade Lorac.
Sí, bueno, creo es parte también del ejercicio que hemos venido haciendo desde que nos enfrentamos a esta situación hasta este momento que es como descubriéndonos. Como le decía, y todo lo referente que Mical describía del mestizaje, todas esas cosas, pues muchas veces eso es lo que impera en nuestra mente. Y como población negra, dominicana de ascendencia haitiana, la nacionalidad en un primer momento no era un problema. Cuando uno nace desde el batey, tú te constituyes o nuestros padres nos declaran y tenemos todo ese proceso. Pero en un momento no nos determinamos si somos dominicanos, si somos haitianos. Y siempre nuestros padres dicen, bueno, como ustedes nacen en el país, ustedes tienen la nacionalidad dominicana. Y por eso nos declararon y todo este proceso. Pero en todo el proceso de ir a la escuela, de llevar un apellido, en experiencia yo, en mis primeros, en la adolescencia, yo en un momento fue difícil. Para mí era difícil tener mi apellido. O sea, mi apellido es Lorac Pies y para la población dominicana es un apellido haitiano. Y para la población dominicana, el haitiano es todo lo opuesto, es todo lo malo, es el diablo, o sea, todas esas realidades donde la gran población y la que crecía, pues no se consideraba haitiana, porque era algo, hablar haitiano, por ejemplo, hablar el creol, que es la lengua natal de nuestros padres, hablarlo, yo no lo podía, no lo quería hablar, lo hablábamos desde el batey con los allegados. ¿Por qué? Luego de que cuando en el 2009, cuando yo tengo ya mi mayoría de edad, 2010, pues me encuentro que a mí no me quieren dar la nacionalidad. Discúlpeme que ya haga esa anécdota. Pues me dicen que no me pueden dar la cédula que me pudiera dar la ciudadanía dominicana. O sea, desde un primer momento, pues nacemos con esto. Cuando cumplo la mayoría de edad establecida por la Constitución Dominicana, pues me dicen que no me lo pueden dar porque mis padres son extranjeros. Y entre comillas, todos sabemos que es haitianos. Y desde ahí es donde es como que algo nos pica. Entonces ahí estaba la realidad. Si yo me enfrento o los grupos en las que pertenecemos nos enfrentamos o nos tiramos a la calle para reivindicar este derecho. Pero reivindicar este derecho tenía que ser el reconocernos descendientes de haitianos. Entonces, ahí es que se da ese proceso y es por eso también que viene todo el nombre del movimiento a la cual pertenezco, se llama Reconocido, porque ha sido un proceso de reconocimiento, pero no solamente el reconocimiento de que el Estado dominicano nos reconozca como dominicana, no, sino también nosotras como reconocimiento de quiénes somos, quiénes son nuestros padres, de que mi apellido, aunque lo tengamos ya en pie, como sea, francesado, haitianizado, como lo dicen, reconocer que son nuestros. Pero desde ahí también nos vamos reconociendo que no solamente esto, no es solamente el ser haitiano, vamos descubriendo quiénes son los haitianos, qué carga traen, cuáles son sus historias. Entonces, reconocernos ahí para poder entonces defender ese derecho de social que nos corresponde, pero también defender esta raíz que llevamos por dentro, que por el cual nos quieren marginalizar. Entonces, desde ahí es que surge el movimiento Reconocido y empezamos a trabajar todas esas cuestiones, ya no solamente de nacionalidad, no solamente de todo el proceso de que si tengo una cédula, porque al final y al cabo entendemos que la cédula es un pretexto. La realidad, el fondo de la realidad es lo que somos, es nuestras raíces, son nuestros padres y desde ahí entonces nos damos la tarea en nosotros construir eso a partir de lo que somos. Y desde ahí entonces también nos vamos descubriendo todas estas realidades que van trayendo el yo reconocerme como dominicana, como descendiente de haitiano o como haitiana, que también es otra lucha. Porque si me reconozco, porque la realidad directamente es si tú eres dominicana o si tú eres haitiana. Y en lo que hablaba Micar del nacionalismo, es también todas esas realidades que se están dando en el país. Hay un nacionalismo, pero muy, muy ultra, que es la que impera, es la que tiene el poder, es poco la población que se denominan ultranacionalistas, pero tienen un poder bien fuerte. Y ese poder, pues, lo utilizan ¿desde quién? Desde nuestra población. Y desde esa, pues, influyen en las leyes, influyen en las políticas sociales, porque como bien decíamos, pues entendíamos que era un problema de nacionalidad, pero es un problema de identidad, de racialidad, desde dónde venimos, porque en el país no solamente existe población migrante haitiana, y ya vamos a tener 10 años constituido como movimiento que defiende el derecho a la nacionalidad de los dominicanos de ascendencia haitiana y promover todo lo que es toda una política de discriminación, de todo el proceso de descolonialización. Y estamos abiertos, pero desde ese tiempo que tenemos no hemos visto ni una sola persona o movimientos en apoyo de otras nacionalidades que están en la misma realidad que nosotras. Todo esto nos indica cómo influye todo este proceso que vamos viviendo. Y a raíz de todo lo que estamos pasando ahora, que hemos venido realizando desde el COVID y todo el proceso, nos hemos dado cuenta cómo estas situaciones afectan de manera directa a las mujeres económicamente, porque la población dominicana de ascendencia haitiana es una población en su gran mayoría joven, pero son de 4 a 3 generaciones. Y el tema de la nacionalidad o la identidad o la ciudadanía, como se ha vendido, es primordial para poder tener esos derechos fundamentales que te garantizan el acceso a derechos. Y entendemos ahora con el contexto que vivimos de la pandemia, esto como movimiento se ha revertido, donde tenemos una población. Anteriormente hablábamos, ¿quiénes se sientan a negociar en las mesas? ¿Quiénes deciden? El gobierno lanza programas o el Estado para poder mitigar todo ese proceso, los efectos del COVID. ¿Pero a quiénes? ¿Ahí entra la población migrante? No. ¿Entra la población dominicana de ascendencia haitiana? No. Se establecen aportes para reducir los impactos en los hoteles, para mejorar la economía, pero ¿quiénes son los que son despedidos sin un salario, sin su cesantía, sin liquidaciones? Es la población negra, que muchas veces tiene que trabajar en el sector construcción, que es donde trabaja la población migrante haitiana en su gran mayoría. Cuando la pandemia, pues esa población tuvo que emigrar, tuvo que irse con las manos vacías. En los hoteles, jóvenes que no contienen una documentación, una cédula de identidad o no es reconocido legalmente, que trabajan de manera informal, son enviados a sus casas. Esos impactos del COVID impacta a esa población directamente. Y estas mujeres migrantes o sus descendientes también tienen, ¿de dónde trabajan? En casa de familia, en el trabajo doméstico, pero también tiene al cargo el cuidado. Pero ese cuidado está su padre, su descendiente que vivió, que hizo toda su vida, se entregó a un país, pero no tiene el derecho garantizado ni a salud, ni a seguros médicos. Entonces, todas esas realidades son las que viven en nuestro país. Y también nos hace desde ese entonces cuestionar desde dónde viene el nacionalismo, o sea, qué nos trae, si al fin y al cabo lo que somos es lo que está en cuestión y es por lo que también nos castigan. Entonces, todas estas cuestiones es las que venimos como desarrollando y cuestionando para poder avanzar y seguir hacia adelante como jóvenes, como mujeres, como hombres, negros, afrodescendientes y todo lo que entendemos que nos atañe desde esta realidad. Gracias, no sé si más o menos respondí la pregunta de Micar.
Comrade, you gave us that and more. Comrade Lorak, really showing you how nationalism can be instrumentalized to bring violence upon certain subjects in a society, certain communities in a society. I will go to Linda, Comrade Bogle, to think through what happens in Bermuda, which is very much a tourist economy. So the way that they think about race conversations concealed, compartmentalized, or communicated in very interesting ways. If you could speak a little bit about that briefly, then I'll go to Comrade Vidal, and then we'll take a question from the audience.
I mean, anytime you're having conversations around tourism, you always make it palatable to the persons you're trying to attract to the country. And so social justice has demanded that we push back and start to make, for a number of years now, advertisement to look like the predominant people in the country. And so, of course, when you're having, like this week, we're having a tournament, a golf tournament, an international golf tournament in the country, and the vast majority of people that are attracted, the ads that go out have more people that look like the people that you're attracting, as opposed to the people that they're actually going to see in the country when they arrive. And so all of these things are conversations that we can now have and say, wait a minute, that doesn't work. Because the majority of the people that you're going to see when you enter the hotels, when you enter the restaurants, when you enter the airport, are going to be people of color, but yet the advertisements don't reflect that. And for us in the working field, when we talk about contracts, when we talk about collective bargaining agreements, we now have to have those conversations about race. We now have to have those conversations about how race will impact those collective bargaining agreements. Also, as the sister said, and you mentioned about nationalism, but also how the immigration policies that we have in this country is going to impact our collective bargaining agreements. We have been calling for immigration reform forever, but it's just been a mute conversation. It's been on the list of the current ruling government forever, but the action on it has been very, very slow, because no one is pushing that as a clear example of, when you talk about immigration, when you talk about broken families that are split up because of immigration policies, when you're talking about persons that are hired and where they're hired from based on those immigration policies, and that impacts the workplace, it's clear that unless we as unions force that conversation, we're going to see policies that are at the table that people that are hired that should come out of the local population are coming out from other countries because of the immigration policy that's lax. It's interesting. COVID has introduced this new thing. I think Barbados mentioned it first, and now Bermuda actually enforced it in law that you can come in Bermuda and work for a year as long as you're not reliant on Bermuda for your income. So if you are a person that's self-employed or you're employed by a country that's willing to let you come and work in Bermuda for a year, then you can do this under this new immigration grant. And, you know, if you really want to have honest conversation, that really opens up an avenue for persons that don't look like us to enjoy the benefits and security of living in a country that will make their life easier. And my point that I'm making is that the ease of which the immigration policy was amended to accommodate speaks to the fact that if you are vested in certain things, you can amend laws and push laws and change laws as you wish. And so that is why social justice is important. That is why the union's involvement in immigration reform is important, because it will ultimately impact the lives of people of color who make up the majority of workers of this country.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bogle, and also framing immigration, as Comrade Lorak did earlier, as an issue of labor, and why it is so important to understand the way that we think we treat people and the different ways that we have, the different systems we have for persons, but it is actually a reflection of one system. And so, Comrade Vidal, multiculturalism, we come from a society where we have two majority ethnic groups, Afro-Trinbagonians and Indo-Trinbagonians, but also nationalism, where we occupied state power as early as 1962, thinking about the complexity of navigating not just these conversations, but organizing around racial justice and this type of historical context and situation.
Yeah, our peculiarity really has to be, again, defined by context, and we also have to have some honest conversations. So when we talk about nationalism, nationalism and nationality, not the same thing. When we talk about our multiculturalism, we want to promote that in Trinidad and Tobago we have this plural society, while at the same time we want everybody's culture to be exactly the same. So we don't embrace the differences that create the plurality, but we want the plurality to exist at the same time. So there are those kinds of contradictions that are at play constantly. But our main problem is dealing with that colonial past of having been a plantation society, a plantation economy, and not deconstructing or dismantling that. The plantation is not an abstraction. 30th of August, 1962, we have to understand that the state had not been deconstructed. The plantation state had not been deconstructed because it existed not just in terms of who ran the country, but in terms of the legislative framework that we worked with. And if you don't deconstruct the legislation, then what happens on the 1st of September when we're now 1962, 1st of September, we're independent, we're running the show, but we're running the show with the same legal framework that existed previously. And what was the purpose of that legal framework? That legal framework was abusive, racist, oppressive. So it doesn't matter who gets in charge, if they look like us or not. They're going to do exactly the same things that were done prior to 1962. And that is the context in which we have this complex interaction. So when we talk about fixing ourselves, or we talk about empowerment of groups and so on, we can't talk that empowerment without talking about deconstructing this plantation. And deconstructing the plantation, the ideas of the plantation are one thing, but we have to deal concretely with the law. 1838 to 1840, throughout the Caribbean, combination laws passed. What are the combination laws? Preventing the formerly enslaved from creating trade unions. For 100 years, the labor legislation up until the 1930s, which gave us the right to actually form trade unions, all of the labor legislation was repressive to force us to stay on the plantation, including a piece of legislation called the Masters and Servants Ordinance, which made absenteeism from work a crime punishable by prison up until 1921. So missing work without an excuse, you could be put in jail up until 1921. The law was adjusted to move from prison to a fine. And the reason I'm using that law as an example is because that law was only taken off our books in 2012. You understand the point? So when we talk about the complexities of our situation, we're trying to fix this thing, and there are pockets of people who are doing it. So because of the way that we function as our communities, as David Rudder says, you know, how we vote is not how we party. So we have all these spaces that we could pretend that all our way is one, all these spaces that we could pretend and behave as if there are no problems. But what COVID has done for us is to strip us of all of those pretend spaces. It stripped us bare. And so now we're forced to face head on who we are. So we had an election in a very raw environment. That was one of the most, I'm trying to find out a good word to use in a public domain, but it really was one of the nastiest election campaigns that we had because what we usually use as events and so on to pretend that all is well weren't there. And so what came out was some of the conversations that we sometimes hide. And those conversations came out in the open. And we had all of these scary things to deal with that we still pretend don't exist. So your conversation, Amilcar, the complexities, the multiculturalism that we have to understand that in the context of our historical experience. And when we talk about nationalism in a Caribbean context, we have to be very careful because the nation state which exists that we want to hold on to is a plantation construct, which is abusive, oppressive, and racist. And if we hold on to that state, so we have to create an entire new state to embrace nationalism. And the plurality allows us an opportunity to do that. But we have to allow the plurality to exist. We can't have a contradiction where we want to be plural, but at the same time, we all want to be exactly the same. And those are the kinds of things that we have to begin to treat with head on and simply understand that it's not because party X or party Y is in office that poor people exist. It's the system that we're using that is making us have these large pockets of poor and impoverished people. But it's easy for the party in power to say, well, it's the other side's fault. And that's why you're going through all this pressure. But Black Stalin, sufferers don't care about race, sufferers. And I was pulling up while we were talking, and I wanna stop with this point here. Nationalism also in the Caribbean, first in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, cannot hinge on the question of nationality, because Sparrow, Grenadian, Labour, Elmer Francois from St. Vincent, Butler, Grenada, right? And then Brother Valentino, also from Grenada, and he has this song, Trinidad is nice, Trinidad is a paradise. But he also goes on to say, yeah, Trinidad is nice, Trinidad is a paradise for men like Sabga, Kupalani, Maraj, and Y Dilemma. So it's a nice place to live, but it depends on who you are. I'll stop there.
Yeah, man, I think I'm biased to Comrade Vidali, bringing up a lot of memories and nostalgia for calypsos that I was raised on. And it's very potent and powerful. I think all the contributions from Comrade Vidal, Comrade Laura, Comrade Bogle help respond to a question that came from the audience as it relates to how is the question of Blackness experienced in the Caribbean as compared to the United States. I think that we may not have weighed in and perhaps may not even enjoy that opportunity to speak to the realities of persons in the United States, but there's a certain type of nuance that we were trying to give to our historical and political situation that explains the labor conditions, the plight of African descended people, and the way Blackness is constructed. I have one question. This is the last question to each member, and I'll start with Atkins. Then we'll go to, Comrade Vidal, then we'll go to Comrade Lorak, and then we'll go to Comrade Bogle, where we're going to respond very quickly to how can the international labor movement support workers and unions in the Caribbean. So the question is, how can international labor movement support workers and unions in the Caribbean? And you could package that with your closing remarks, and then I'll bring on the esteemed comrade Terence Melvin to do the closing.
Yeah, one of the critical rules for the international labor organizations, and we have to remember that international labor is not homogeneous either. Okay, so you have left and right leaning international bodies, just as you have left and right at your domestic level, which creates another kind of dynamic. But what is critical is solidarity, and also lending technical support. One of the challenges we have now is this question of these multinational companies, and that might take an international response from the trade union movement everywhere these companies are, to treat with these companies in the spaces that they exist. So that's one. With union busting and the decreasing numbers, you may very well have to get your numbers from the collective, from both domestic and external, to be able to lay bare the same kind of support that we may have had years ago. And I think that those are, I know we're short on time, so I just want to make those 2 points, and I'm sure that the other comrades would add some additional ones as they do their presentation. And in closing, I just want to say thank you again for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this forum.
Comrade Lorak. Comrade Lorak, would you like to make your contributions on the question of international labor movement and support for workers and unions in the Caribbean, and as well as your closing remarks?
Bueno, para mí y también ya más yo entiendo como el compañero, debe de haber toda esa solidaridad directamente entre cada una de esos movimientos sindicatos laborales a nivel internacional. También todo lo que es como veníamos hablando, o sea, el espacio, el aprovechar el espacio y de ver todo lo que se puede hacer en articulación, tanto como red de apoyo, que pueda intervenir y fortalecer esas redes sindicales a nivel tanto nacional, porque una de las cosas que últimamente está en merma es también todas esas fuerzas, tanto nacionales como laborales. Hay una palabra que se dice que en la unión hace la fuerza. Aunque directamente en cada uno de los países o de la región las realidades sean diferentes, pero no menos cierto que cada uno de los movimientos, los sindicatos, buscan un mismo objetivo, que es la persona o por el cual se lucha, pues pueda restablecer o pueda tener sus derechos garantizados. Y para eso también una de lo que se está perdiendo es ¿cómo le decimos aquí? Es la desintegración también de los movimientos sindicales laborales directamente en los países. El contribuir a que esto se siga expandiendo y que pueda seguir abogando por los derechos de los trabajadores negros en todos los países, yo considero que debe ser lo primordial para poder llegar a este objetivo que todas y todos queremos, entendiendo que directamente nuestras experiencias directos como movimiento es muy diferente a todo el que es un movimiento laboral a nivel nacional.
Thank you very much, Comrade Lorak, and we go to Comrade Bogle for a response to the question and closing remarks.
Thank you, brother. I was wondering, I was trying in my mind for a minute to think of the way I want to say this, but I can only be myself, right? And so I think international unions need to have self-reflection. Start with self-reflection first and then be the standard bearers, right? Because a lot of the issues that we speak about, the reality is it also translates into how international unions treat persons of color and organizations of color, and particularly those within the Caribbean, and how they see their contributions and their value. And so self-reflection on how they themselves are dealing with the question of Black Lives Matter and intersectionality and xenophobia and transphobia and homophobia is important. And once they set a standard, then that standard must trickle down into the unions and hold those unions that are their affiliates and their associates accountable to the same standard. So I think it's important to have that reflection and then trickle down.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bogle, Comrade Lorak, and Comrade Vidal for the opportunity to listen to your insights and perspectives about really our collective Caribbean reality, but understanding the situation does take on certain dynamics in our respective territories. I'm definitely grateful for the opportunity to also facilitate a dialogue as part of the Global African Workers. And now I'd like to bring on Comrade Terence Melvin to wrap things up for all of us.
Thank you so much to our moderator and facilitator and the panelists that we have heard from today. This is the reason why we come together, because we really want to be able to understand what is happening across the entire diaspora and how it relates to Black workers, whether they are in a union or not. We are concerned about all Black workers across this globe. I want to thank each and every one of you for your participation in this dialogue that we had today, and understand from the Global African Worker Institute viewpoint, this is the beginning of a dialogue that we need to have across the globe. As I said when I started, this is a part of a series of weekly dialogues we're having. On next week, we'll be going to Eastern Africa to have a similar dialogue with our brothers and sisters from that area. I want to especially thank you to our sister Agrippina and Mercedes for helping coordinate this piece of the program. PSI for the work that they did in helping us pull together the program. And for each one of you who took the opportunity to come out, to the co-chair, vice chair of the GAW-Caribbean from ITCU Africa, who was on with us today. I want to thank him for his leadership and the work that he has done. But I want to encourage you that don't just look at this as a one-time opportunity to come together to talk about what is going on in the Caribbean. While this is a rich discussion, we must figure out how to inculcate this entire discussion into what we need to be doing on a global map, if you will, on how we move the issues of Black workers to the forefront and not behind. If you look at the history of this world, We have built this world to what it is today. Yet there are those who are trying to put us in second and third and fourth class citizenship in all the areas that we have built up. So we want to use this forum to come together as a collective, to learn from each other, to learn how we can help each other, and to build on what we've done individually from where we are. Understand that there's a different history and culture in the Caribbean as there is on the motherland, as there is in Europe, as there is in the United States, as there is in South America. But we believe if we come together collectively, hear from each other, that we can put together a collective global plan where we can vet some of these issues and going up and be the network to be able to bring the resources that are needed. When the Caribbean calls out for help, we should be able to bring in our brothers and sisters from either the motherland or from the United States or Europe to come in and help you, and vice versa. We've got to be there for each other. So once again, I thank you for participating in this discussion. I thank the moderator, I thank our panelists for the great discussion that we've had today. And I encourage you to log on each Thursday for the next few Thursdays as we go around the globe and have this same discussion and add to your voice to that discussion. So thank you very much. God bless you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Amén. Bueno, muchas gracias.